October 18th,
Yeah, that's right.
2012.
Okay, Conard, what brought you and your family to the Entiat Valley?
Well, on my mother's side, there's kind of a family story that my granddad, who was a cowboy in the hill country in just northwest of San Antonio, Texas, based on a land grant that his grandfather got from serving in the Mexican War. And things were pretty hard back in the 1915 along through there, and they weren't doing too well, and he heard of a rumor that they were paying 3 cents a box out in Washington State for picking apples. And a rather cynical joke is that no man in his right mind with a bride and 2 baby girls is going to turn down a deal like that. So he made his way out to Washington State and got a job where the Entiat High School is now, in an orchard that was owned by a Dr. Whidbey at the time, picking apples. And sure enough, he got 3 cents a box, and he had an opportunity then to stay on and to be an irrigator in that orchard the next summer. And one thing led to another, and they never went back to Texas. We had a friend named Julius Dunn that lived in Entiat, and a job came up for a man named Ed Cairns, who had an orchard just north of Entiat, and had an opportunity to get a irrigating job in that orchard, and so they moved to Entiat in 1929. And that's how my grandparents got, on my mother's side, got to Entiat in the first place. On my father's side, my maternal father's side, they were Quakers, and they came to Entiat in 1919 to help support the Quaker colony that existed in the Entiat area at that time. And he was an electrician and a telephone technician, and those weren't real common in those days, and he did pretty well. And they stayed in Entiat then until 1940. And my mother and his son got together just after they got out of high school in 1930 and got married. And I was a result of that marriage in September 28, 1933. And that's how I got started.
Okay. How did you make a living over the years?
Well, I went to work in the woods when I was 17, and I was a logger for almost 30 years, which included a short stint at the sawmill at the end. But I quit logging and working in the woods in 1970 and bought the family orchard there at where I live now, and bought that in 1972, and never did make enough money to get away from it, so I'm still there. I kind of retired 5 years ago and got the place leased out now, but I still live there and still own the property.
You told me once that when you were up in the woods, you could hear the train coming through the long tunnel through the Cascades.
Yeah.
And that was kind of an unusual
It
experience.
I've heard other people make the same claim, and whenever we talk about that, they look at us like we just fell out of an airplane or something. But it's kind of a weird phenomenon, but yeah, you could hear the roar of the electric engines. Made a different sound than the steam engines. They didn't have a humming roar to them. You have to experience it to really understand it. But that's what it was.
And how did it sound?
Oh, it's kind of a hum, a real low-pitched hum, and a kind of a grinding noise in the background. And it kind of sings. That's kind of a, I don't know how good of an explanation that is, but it's just peculiar, and once you hear it, you never forget it. And I've heard several people say they had the same experience. Usually in a real quiet, when the air is real quiet and there's not much disturbance, no wind or anything like that. And usually occurs in the spring of the year, May, June, along there sometime. I haven't heard it in quite a while. Maybe it, well, we don't have those electric engines anymore, but But anyway,
Who were your neighbors?
when we,
Anytime.
The neighbors you remember the most had some influence on your growing up.
well, that's kind of hard to, when we first came to Entiat in 1942, there was a lot of changes going on. Neighbors were coming and going, and a lot of people were making adjustments with respect to their financial positions, and that was a result of the Great Depression. And people were pulling up their orchards and moving on and buying and selling land, and at that time we're still kind of in that mode. And so I remember a lot of people, but we on the east side never had any neighbors, and on the west side there was a guy that was, his name was Alden Jones, and he married the sister of the man that my stepdad bought the place from. And she was a little bit nuts, deaf as a post, and she had a tendency toward paranoia. She'd get the idea that somebody's trying to do something to her, and she'd go along, she'd be sweet old lady and all of that, and then all at once she'd go into this mode of paranoia, and she'd think that, what are you up to? And she looked at everybody and everything with real suspicious. She wouldn't depend on, she wouldn't answer the door, she wouldn't answer the phone, or any of those kinds of things. I remember that about her because I used to sit in a bay window in the house still there, and look at the Country Gentleman magazines. Now, the Country Gentleman magazine was something like the Saturday Evening Post, but it catered to farmers. And it had a lot of pictures in it and cartoons and stuff, and I kind of liked that. And I used to sit, and they had every issue, I guess, it was ever printed, stacked there about 4 feet high. And I used to sit there, and she'd feed me dried cherries and such as that on her good days. And on her bad days, she wouldn't even let me in the house. And I was probably 8, 9 years old, something like that. But I do remember her. And I guess, you know, I knew Everett Knapp, I knew Louis Dinkelman, I knew Hez Rogers, all those people lived around close there, but I never really got to know them. And when I went to work in the woods, of course, when you work in the woods, you're way out in the woods, and you don't have contact with people. And you'll go to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week in those days, if you can believe that. And we just never had much of an opportunity to I probably made more friends and learned and met more people when I was in high school than I did any other time in my life. And of course, those people are mostly scattered all over, are gone now, so do have occasion to get together in reunions once in a while and renew some acquaintances and some things like that, which I'm grateful for. But I never had a lot of real close association with neighbors.
Okay.
What was your job when you were working in the woods?
Well, when I went to work in the woods, I went to work on what they call working on the rigging, which is the equipment that drags the logs out of the woods into the landing. And what you got to do is you got these pair of tongs. It's like what a pair of tongs are, and they weighed about 50 pounds. So when you had to stick them under your arm and go down the mountain, hook onto a log, signal your buddy, he'd signal the yarder operator, and the yarder operator dragged the log in. The difficult part was there was 600 feet of main line on the drum, and when you were out at the end of the line, that didn't make any difference. You still had to be back up, take your turn for the next round. So it didn't take very long for you to build some legs and lungs if you stayed with it. I had the very good fortune to work with a couple of old timers that really knew their stuff. They probably saved my life a dozen times. It's dangerous. It's fast. The drum speed is 600 feet, 500-600 feet a minute, depending on whether the drum's empty, the drum's full of line. The more line there's on the drum, the faster the speed is.
They call it a choker?
No, it's just a long line.
Just a long
Yeah, a
line?
pair of tongs on it.
Yeah.
Now with the cats, the tractors, you had chokers.
Okay.
And I did that a little bit, but mostly I worked on the rigging. I did that I learned to run a chainsaw and learned how to stay alive and a lot of general uh, stuff that you have to learn. And 1954, 1955 it was, I went running the cat.
Mhm.
And I run cats all the rest of my career in the woods most of the time. I learned to fall timber. Got a lot of skills. Learned a little bit about surveying because I had to run a lot of lines and learned a lot about how to know whether you're level or you're going up or down. So, you know, a lot of stuff you had to had to learn. And I enjoyed running the cat. Most of the people that went to work in the woods either wanted to cut logs or drive a truck. That was what most young people, especially, come into the woods. I never had any inclination to drive a truck. That same scenery back and forth, didn't have a lot of appeal to me. But I did like the challenge of there those logs are up there on the hill. How are you going to get them? You know, and the challenge, the engineering that goes with it, and the understanding of what the machine will do, and what you can expect of it, and how you can get the logs together and drag them down the mountain, get them off the landing, the cheapest, fastest, easiest, safest way. And sometimes those combinations are not easy to
Right.
to bring into reality. But I never got fired, so I guess I got the job done. Look, I met a lot of fine people. Met a lot of nuts and cranks, but a lot of fine people in the woods too.
Sure.
I remember. Have fond memories of working with over the years. I had an uncle that I worked with for nearly 30 years, and even if he was a relative, he was a great guy. And I think he passed away a year ago. It was a family at the funeral. When I told the kids, I said that your dad and I spent a lot of years together, and it's some of the finest years of my life.
Mm-hmm.
That relationship that we had working together.
What kind of events or hardships do you remember from the past? It could be fires or snowstorms or windstorms.
Well, of course, the flood in 1948 stands out, and everybody that can remember that, because the Entiat River did things it has never done since. And when I tell people some of the things that I saw with my own eyes, you know, I realize I'm talking to somebody who probably thinks I'm either on to something or making up stories. But that was probably the most phenomenal. You had to seen it to believe it. I can't. It was clear out. In fact, the matter is, it occupied a major part of the last glacier channel that the river cut down. Not going to clear full, but it was getting up to the limits. If you know where I live there, the river was clear up almost to my garage doors. And if you look at the river now, look where my garage door is, no, Conard, you can't, no. Don't expect me to believe that. But fact is that it did, and we were very lucky. Nobody got killed. A lot of damage done. The highway was washed out. Power lines were down. Telephone was out. Nobody could get their mail. It was weeks before they got electricity restored. The mail route was restored. They made some detours around the washouts, and the mail was being delivered again in a week or two. But it was a long time before things got back to normal. Sawmill was almost wiped out, not quite, but lost their logs. All went down the river, and the dam went out. And it was a very distressing time. We've had a lot of forest fires, of course, and most of us can remember most of those. First of the worst fires was, as I recall, was in '58, when the fire started out here someplace and wound up almost up to where Russ Griffith lives, on that side, and destroyed all that. Used to be a lot of little small forests of pine trees on Little Bear Mountain. You can still see the dead trees laying on the ground, but that was the first of the bad fires. And then I don't know if I can remember the chronology of all of them, but there was the Gold Creek fire in '68, and of course the big Entiat fire in 1970, and the 1980 fire that wiped out the mountains around my place, the '94 fire that was so devastating in Muddy Creek, and the Upper Entiat fire, and there's been other fires, but fires in general have been I guess it's an emotional thing. When Mills Canyon went out in '88, it was 3 years before I could generate the emotional. I knew what I was going to see, and I didn't want to see it. and I saw it, and it was all right. But it was an emotional thing for me because I can remember when I was about 8 years old, and I'd go with my stepdad down on a logging job, and they were logging up on Lincoln Ridge up behind my house there, and you could stand on top of the ridge there. And as far as you could see, way back into the Mad River country and way over into the Muddy Creek country, not all that country back in there, we just one big forest that had never seen an axe or a saw except just up the main corridor of the Entiat Valley. And it's all gone. And it was an emotional time for me. But I get older and tougher and meaner and all that. It's easier to take, but fires have been. We've had other things too. We've had. I remember in the winter of '49, the temperature got down 20 below zero for a while, and anything that could freeze did. And a lot of people weren't prepared for that kind of. Most people are prepared for a few days of zero, but 20 below. We had a bobsled that my stepdad made, a bunch of his cronies, and they tried it on Tiger Ridge and pretty near killed themselves. Kind of hung the thing up, but when we were in high school, we got it down again, and we would, me and a bunch of my cronies around there, would take the bobsled up to the warehouse there on top of the hill where Mike Summerfield lives, and the warehouse is still there, and we would put it under the porch. And then when the school bus would come home, we'd drag the sled out, and it was a 8-man sled. Drag it all the way up to Jim Buchanan, that's 2 miles up Mills Canyon, and come down, and it's dark. We put the sled back in the porch. We do that all week. And then on weekends, a lot of times we'd get a pickup and we'd drag it up and spend the day, build a big fire on the upper end. And when we wore the ice off of the road, while we'd carry water, and we're talking 20 below zero, and ice the road, and we come down out of there in just a little 2 miles in just a minute and a half.
Oh boy.
And yeah, it was that was what we did. but it was so cold that winter, and that was a thing to remember about it. And of course, the thing I also remember about that is that I forget what day it was. A day in February. It was cold, 20 below zero, and come a Chinook, and in 10 minutes, temperature is about 45. Now you talk about water running. There was water every place. It didn't do any damage, but of course, the weather broke, and that was the end of that. We've had other cold winters. I remember the damage of the fruit trees in '49. Cold killed a lot of trees again in '67, I believe it was. We had a cold spell. It wasn't quite that bad. As quite bad as it was in '49, but it was cold, and it got cold fairly early, and that's bad, and killed a lot of fruit trees. We lost a lot of fruit trees, and fruit trees died for years. That's a progressive thing. Frost damage, especially when it's the cambium of the bark of the tree, it's a progressive thing, and the tree can't replace itself because what happens was it expands the bark and splits it away from the wood, and it doesn't have a seal there anymore. Mm-hmm. And as the tree tries to recover from it, the process of cell renewal just doesn't repair that. And along the edges of that damage, it keeps expanding so that the tree dies a little bit every year, and some years it'll be more, some years it'll be less, depends on the weather in the wintertime. But usually it means you've lost your trees. It may take 5 years or longer to lose your trees, but that was what was devastating about them. People tried to bridge graft and do a lot of things like that, and some things worked, some things didn't. But there was a lot of fruit trees lost. And a lot of people lost a lot of their crops. And there's been smaller frost in the spring where pollination didn't happen and the bees couldn't work and those kinds of things. I can't think of. Well, there have been some hailstorms. That's where we live. Been pretty lucky since I've been on that place. Had 2 hailstorms that really done the damage. had other hail damage, but I mean, hailstorms that wiped us out. We've had two, and then of course, nearly 70 years, that's not bad. But other places further down the valley and further up the valley, especially up around John Hinton and above there, had a much worse history of hail than we have right where I'm at. So we've been grateful for that.
You've had temperature and fire, and how about earthquake?
Earthquakes have been interesting. I don't think we've ever suffered any damage that I know of, any consequence right locally. There was an earthquake in 1949 or 50. I was in high school, and I was walking down the hall, and I looked over into the office, and didn't have computers, had adding machines in those days. You know what I'm talking about? It was on a little cart thing on wheels, and the full thing was rolling around in the on the floor, and then it could feel it. And that was the earthquake. That there was a big cornice fell off a building in Seattle and killed a man. Not just incidental, but that was one of the worst earthquakes. And they didn't have the seismic equipment that they got now, so I don't know what, you know. But anybody that had any concrete didn't mind anything, it got cracked. It was an earthquake in 1943 or 4. I wasn't very old, but I can remember my mother was standing on the table painting the ceiling and knocked her off the table. And spilled the paint, made a big mess. But anyway, those are the two earthquakes that I can remember. I had one hit this spring. Sitting there watching television, bam, you know. Earthquakes are different. Sometimes they come like a rifle shot, sometimes they just shake a little, sometimes you can hear them, sometimes they make different noise like blowing wind, sometimes like a gun going off. I don't know what the difference is, maybe it's which direction the earth is moving. But there was that one, and I suppose in my lifetime I've probably recognized a couple dozen earthquakes.
When you were in high school, did you help put your class number on
Oh
your
yeah,
mountain?
oh yeah.
Do you have any
Yeah.
story that went along with that?
Well, I remember there's a tradition, or was a tradition, I don't know whether they still have it or not, but when the seniors put their number up, the juniors had 24 hours to obliterate it if they could. And so when we were juniors and the seniors put their number up, we decided, go up and do them some dirt. So what we did is we got an old log truck tire that was wore out and put a bunch of diesel oil in it and went up there with a piece of that aluminum power line cable that they use. Big cable, you know, and tied it to a fir tree and set that tire on fire and let it down with a cliff there with a piece of cable and anchored the cable off to a tree and got our rear ends out of there. Well, he didn't understand about the laws of physics. Aluminum cable won't stand that kind of heat. Of course, it melted in two, and that turned the tire loose. It rolled down the mountain, scattering fire, all down the mountain, wound up down the hobo jungle. And the hobo jungle used to be right across the river from where the Friends Church is. So, down a lot of old cars down there, and transients that would come in to work, and we call them winos, to work in the fruit, would live in those old cars. We call that the hobo jungle. Anyway, a tire rolled down in there and hit one of those cars, and there was a hobo in there, and shaking his fist at it. But that was a year before we put our number up. When we put our number up, we just took an aluminum ladder up there and tankered it off on, probably a tree, and worked off of that. The 51 is 14 feet square. And it took us about a week to do it. The girls in the class made the template. And we took that up there and laid it out, and then painted a big white square, and then put the template over it and painted the 51. Well, it took us about a week. But back in those days, it was a quasi-school project. It's integrated. It was part of the deal, and not that way anymore. Put the number up there now, you got to do it on your own. Liability.
Sure.
I think it's fortunate that in the 26, 56, 50, 60, however many years it's been, nobody's ever been hurt.
I've heard that when they paint the number up there, they have to do it by hand. You can't do it with a spray can or a sprayer. Is that right?
I don't know. You know, we put ours on with regular paint brush. Of course, back in 1950, aerosol came. But I don't. Is there a reason for that, or something?
I don't know. That's just what I've heard, that you have to paint it on with brush.
Well, you can't. You got to use a oil-based paint. It won't stick on the rock. Back then you did. Now I've lost track of all that since, so I don't know what paint is now. But back then you couldn't use a water-based paint, let it wash off. So, but anyway, yeah, that was a lot of fun. I remember being up all night.
I've been asking people to tell a story about their past or describe someone they remember. And I remember you telling about a settler that lived high in Winesap Canyon, Joe, was it Obenliner?
Oblitner.
Oblitner.
Oblitner, yeah.
Could you tell us about him?
I didn't know Joe Oblitner. He was one of the homesteaders that had this wheat field up there right next to the Manoy place. I believe his place was east and north of the Manoy place. It wasn't as big a wheat field as the Manoy place was, but he was kind of an eccentric, and he turned up missing. Nobody knew where he was, nobody knew anything about him, and went on and went on. Somebody figured, well, he crawled off somewhere and died, or somebody had murdered him and buried him, or something, and finally he turned up, and all, he'd just been away on a trip. Grant Roundy knows more of the details of that than I do. In fact, what I remember of it is what I remember of him sharing with us when I worked with him for a while up here, working in the woods, and he was telling us a little bit about that. But this old Blitner was German, Russian German, whatever that means, and came to this country from the old country. Very reclusive, and nobody, one of these kind of guys, stayed by himself. But he did have a son that graduated from high school in about 1925, somewhere along in there. So we do have that. But anyway, that's about all I know about Joe.
Okay. What can you tell us about the Entiat phone system?
Phone system?
Phone system.
Well, my grandfather was instrumental in getting that started. Well, Frank Knapp put in the first phone system in about 1920, somewhere along in there. But it was a closed system. I mean, you called people around Entiat, but that's... And you picked up the phone and you turned on a little crank, and the operator would ask you for the number, and you'd tell them what the number was, and she'd plug something in. But when my grandfather came, it was under his expertise in engineering and all that they got hooked up with the Wenatchee, larger. The world became larger as a result of that. When we first got a phone in Entiat, moved here in 1942, it was still pretty much locally, pretty much doing only, you turn the crank. There were 4 party lines, and if you were on the line, you had to know the number, and our number was 3F21. And a 2-1 was the key, because a 2-1 meant 2 longs and a short. So if somebody was going to call me, they'd have to turn the little crank, 2 longs and a short one, you'd have to go through the operator. But if you went outside your 4 party line, then you had to go to the operator and tell her what number you wanted, and they were all numbers with a number and a letter of the alphabet, and then 2 more numbers, which kind of identified the area you were in and some things like that. But if you wanted to call Wenatchee, then you had to go to the operator, and you'd have to call the Wenatchee operator. I remember if you called Seattle or Spokane or California or any place, it wasn't just a casual wasn't none of that. You had to have some time to spend. You had to be committed to it, because I can remember if you called, say, New York, or you could call New York. But I remember listening on the phone as the call went from town to town, you know, and it would say, this is Spokane, a number please, and give it Spokane, and then it would maybe be Helena, Montana. You'd hear that operator come in, and then Spearfish, South Dakota, you'd hear it come in, and you clear across the country. You could hear these different, as it jumped from city to city, until you got to wherever your destination was, and of course it was all kind of popping, snapping, and crackling, and funny noises on the phone. Isn't like it is at all now. And a couple of bucks for a phone call, which in those days was a lot of money to spend on a phone call. But it was not anything like it is now. To call a foreign country was, you have to wait your turn on the Atlantic cable and all that stuff. But of course, people in Entiat never had much opportunity or occasion to call way off. But I remember when Dad was in the contract logging business, and you have to order spare parts from some manufacturer in Marion, Ohio, or Lorain, Ohio, or some of those manufacturing, Peoria, Illinois, or where all these big industries were in those days. You couldn't get anything in Seattle. You had to go, and you had to make those phone calls, order parts. So I remember doing that. But telephone service was pretty much limited to the core of the valley up until 1950, when they began to spread out a little bit. And they were kind of not in league with, but along with contemporary with the PUD. See, the Rural Electrification Act, which was enacted in 1932 or 3, I'm not sure I'm right on that or not. But anyway, it mandated that electric companies had to provide people with power. You couldn't just grab the core of the community and everybody on the peripheral, you know, was in the dark. You had to give everybody equal opportunity. Well, there were people that lived up Crum Canyon, and there were people who lived up Mills Canyon, and there were people who lived up Mad River, and there were people who lived way up the Entiat Valley and scattered all over that never actually got their power until well into the 1950s. They finally got it, but it took a long time to implement it, because that meant putting in poles and string line and all those kinds of things. And the PUD in those days did not have the kind of equipment that they got now. I mean, they can run out there with $1 million worth of equipment now and throw up a line a day or two. Back then, it was a month's project to do that. So, and the telephone companies were, were working right along with it. But it was in the middle 1950s before the project was complete. Power was put up the Entiat River as far as it is now. I believe sometime in the 1960s, they had to extend it from Brief on up. I believe it was Brief, on up several more miles. And now all those people up there have electricity now. But I had an aunt that lived at the mouth of Indian Creek and Mad River. Took care of Charlie Gray in his old age. And they had coal oil lamps. Those were light until 1955.
Well, what part of Entiat's past that no longer exists do you miss the most?
That?
What do you miss the most?
Well, I've shared this with some others. In the old town before the dam was built, Entiat was a nucleus. It was a community center. It's where people went to spend their money and to take care of their business and all those kinds of things that a community center is. There was 5 gas stations, if you can believe, 2 car dealers, hardware store, a couple dry goods stores, 2 grocery stores, a tavern, liquor store, library, blacksmith, lumber yard. It was a diverse community. I would say, I don't think I'd be exaggerating to say that 80% of the payroll of the orchards and the sawmill was spent in Entiat. Because that's where they went to get their groceries, that's where the women went to get their hair fixed, that's where you got your shoes, that's where you got your saddle repaired, where you got your chicken feed, sack of nuts and bolts for 10 pounds, 20 penny nails, whatever. You know, you went to town, you go to Wenatchee for that stuff. And the people also there went for their social times. There was always a square dance or something on the weekend, sometimes a social dance. The school always had something going on up there. There was a couple of fraternal organizations that had their meetings and doings. The Boy Scouts were active. Trail and Saddle Club was there. The Grange was an active organization. A lot of people belonged to the Grange. A lot of these kinds of fraternal and entertainment things, there was usually always a dance at school on weekends. Had a movie theater, and all of these things that represented the things that the town does. And after the town moves, that's all gone. You don't have that nucleus there, that center that people gathered to. Wenatchee was a place you went if you needed a doctor, if you needed an appendicitis operation, if you're going to have a baby. That's when you went. That's when you went to Wenatchee. And other than that, and usually going to Wenatchee was an all-day project. People would save their business up, and if they had business in Wenatchee, you had to see a lawyer, a dentist, and those kinds of professional people. That weren't available in Entiat, people would say, "Look, and go to town." I can remember my grandparents would get up early in the morning and go to Wenatchee, be down there all day. Another thing too, people sold a lot of their produce in Entiat to the grocery store. Back in those days, you didn't have the Food Quality Protection Act. And I raised chickens. I had 50 laying hens, and when I was in high school, I bought my class ring and paid for all my books and sweaters and all that stuff, my chicken money. And they'd take them down Old Man Risk, and he'd give me 32 cents a dozen, or whatever it was. I was in a rich city. I can't do that anymore because of the Food Quality Protection Act. But that's the biggest thing that I miss, is that sense of connection and belonging and civic. I guess you could call it civic pride, if nothing else, because it's gone. And of course, if you never experienced it, you don't miss it. But for some of us, it was a big loss and a disappointment too, because most of us had higher anticipation of what the new town would be. We had a vision of the continuing that service center, that idea of the community center, and something that reached beyond the city limits. It was in, the whole area, lack of the whole school district. But I guess I missed that most of any other part of it.
Well then, even though that's still missing, what do you appreciate most about Entiat and the area now?
Well, I guess I appreciate the fact that it's still here. There's a lot of things that could have went wrong that would have said, well, that ain't worth the trouble. That's behind us now. But to start with, this didn't happen easy. I remember back in 1945 when the town was first incorporated. That did not happen easy. There were a lot of people that did not want the municipal aspect of being a city where there was taxes and a government and bureaucracy and somebody telling you what to do. Even back in those early days, you had that. But it finally, after about 4 or 5 votes and a whole lot of haggling and threatening and all that, they finally incorporated. And I guess that kind of thing was reenacted. There was some very unfortunate. There was 2 or 3 people that owned all the property, and they wanted prices that would be high by today's standards. This was back in the 1960s. It didn't happen. And the organization, the foundation of laying out of the town and stuff was flawed. And now this is my opinion. We reacted more on the expertise of people that were professionals and that didn't understand community interactions and stuff, and made plans that were based solely on aesthetic and based on things that weren't emotional, and didn't have anything to do with values, traditional values, anything like that. Strictly professional planning, which was all right, but it didn't cater to what some of us had envisioned for the city to be, and didn't. And as a result, there was a certain amount of rebellion, and that's what you got now. You got. Of course, it's kind of moved now because the whole thing's in the city now. So, but back then it wasn't. This was a city, and that was Chelan County. Wait a minute, I'm backwards here. The part,
Yeah.
the part out this side of the part that's strung out along the highway there was county then, and of course the city was up there where the grocery store is and the post office. That's all changed now. But it wasn't what some of us envisioned that the new town would be. A lot of the old timers that had businesses and had been in Entiat for a long time were getting on in years, and they didn't want to, buy land and spend a whole bunch of money. And you're 70, my age, you're be up past that. The new people that are coming in, they were strictly, I was just going to pay off a financial or business arrangement, and they didn't have any. They didn't have the traditional values and that was in the old town. So it just never materialized. Forest Service, of course, moved in, and that helped. Forest Service, before it was in Entiat, was up in the mouth of still cocaine. And when the town moved, well, they took advantage of that and moved in, and that helped. But it wasn't the same, and it isn't the same, and never will be the same. And that's not, I'm not being critical, that's the way it is. The same way with the school, the school was, the students had a lot more responsibility, especially in the high school. The students had a lot more responsibility than they do now, and they handled the money, a lot of it, and made a lot of the decisions. And I'm not being critical, don't misunderstand me, it's just the way it is. It's just the way that it is, and I could keep a set of books when I was a sophomore in high school. A simple set of books. I don't mean to say that I could account for Standard Oil or anything like that, but I knew how to balance a checkbook. I knew how to keep track of accounts. I knew how the double entry system worked, and I learned that with a broken leg. Fell off a cliff up Mills Canyon, broke my leg, and when I went to school, I was taking a bookkeeping class. I was afraid I was going to get behind, so I really bored after it. And when I went back to school, I was way ahead of the rest of the class.
Well, it sounds to me like you appreciated your education.
I did. I got a good education. I'm proud of my education.
Made the best of a broken leg.
I did. Well, I learned a lot of stuff. I mean, and I'm not being critical. Don't misunderstand me, kids. I'm not being critical, but it was just. Boy, I tell you, I didn't particularly like it at the time, but we were taught a lot of stuff, and it did lay a foundation for my understanding of world history today and where we're going, what's going on in the world, and why things work the way they do, and all those kinds of things. Got to give Entiat High School credit, because that's where I got my foundation. Learned the Euclidean geometry, algebra, learned chemistry, biology, history, geography. I knew where Ceylon was, Madagascar.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Got that all at Entiat High School.
Sure, you're talking